Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, when the RMS Titanic sank in the early hours of April 15th, 1912, its vast hulk essentially became a giant time capsule. The bow section, or front of the ship, sank so slowly and gradually that many items inside were perfectly preserved, frozen in time, with many of those items left in exactly the same place where their owners had put them. Fast forward 110 years, and many of these details are still there. Today, let's take a look at 5 of the most fascinating Titanic wreck details that have survived all these years. Titanic existed in a world of strict social conventions, especially as regards the way that you had to dress. Men and women were expected to maintain a strict standard when in public, and this was true across all 3 classes on the ship. There were some specific rules that couldn't be broken in polite company. For example, men's braces, the straps which held the trousers up, were considered a form of underwear at the time and were not to be seen. As such, they were covered by the waistcoat or vest. Another strict rule surrounded hats. They weren't just a fashion accessory like they are today. At the time, your hat could tell a lot about your social position, and they also served a practical purpose. They could keep you shaded from the sun in summer and keep your head warm in winter, but they could also cover your head in an era when frequent washing of hair was not all that common, and wearing a hat could protect your head from grime or soot from all the chimneys around. As a man, you'd raise your hat when greeting a lady and take it off when inside without fail. And in summer, if you were well off, you'd buy a new straw boater hat, and in winter, you'd sport a fur Homburg or bowler hat. The lower classes could only afford the cheapest fabric hats, and that's why these flat caps were so often seen on the heads of Titanic's third-class passengers and crew. What you might be surprised to see, though, were the remains of a bowler hat well preserved in the Titanic's hull. In 2001, down in the ship's hull on D-Deck at stateroom D33, explorer and filmmaker James Cameron sent a robot submersible with a camera to document the interior. D33 was one of the more basic first-class staterooms on the ship, and when the robot poked its head inside, there was little recognisable as having once been a ship's cabin. Light poured in through a porthole from a submarine on the outside, and debris littered the floor. But there, sitting clearly on the ground, was the brim of a man's hat, perfectly preserved on top of the remains of what might have once been a crumbled wardrobe. Fortunately, we actually know who inhabited this stateroom and who the hat even belonged to, and it's a remarkable story. On the 10th of April 1912, the Titanic was anchored off Cherbourg, France, when aboard stepped Mr. Henry Sleeper Harper and his wife Myra. The wealthy couple had been on a vacation in Europe and Asia, and in Egypt they had employed and kept on an interpreter, Mr. Hamad Hassab, and his mysterious, quiet presence aboard became a topic of hushed conversation among the other first-class passengers. At the couple's heels was their Pekingese dog, Sun Yat-sen. On the night the Titanic hit the iceberg, the Harpers were woken from their sleep and made the trek topside to the lifeboats. They waited outside the gymnasium on the starboard side of the ship, and this was exactly the right place to be. Officer Murdoch, in charge of loading the boats on that side, was allowing men on if no other women could be found. And incredibly, every member of the Harper party, including Hassab and the Pekingese dog, were allowed into lifeboat number 3 and survived the sinking. Today, the Harper's stateroom lies intact in the ship's bow section, and Henry's hat, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't actually been recovered and sits there to this day. Interestingly, their stateroom porthole is swung wide open. It's unlikely that the ship's sinking or impact with the sea floor caused this, because the portholes were extremely heavy duty and unlocking them required the unscrewing of a large bolt. Instead, it's likely that one of the Harpers opened it on the night of the sinking, either to get free air or directly after the collision to try to see if there was anything happening outside. At the time of the Titanic's introduction, the wireless set that the ship carried was one of the most powerful afloat. The Titanic's wireless room was up on the boat deck in a crew-only area nearby the bridge, and it was one of the few ships at sea to carry 2 wireless operators working around the clock. The range of the set was dictated by the ship's aerial, and for that purpose, the Titanic carried a massive one spanning around 600 feet or 180 meters between the Titanic's 2 tall masts. This, plus the sheer power of its electrical machinery, 5 kilowatts, gave Titanic a voice which, depending on atmospheric conditions, could carry out from 250 to 2,000 miles. If you were a passenger on the Titanic, sending a message mid-Atlantic Ocean to friends and family back home or overseas was a technological marvel. You could go down to the inquiry office on C-Deck and dictate a message, charged per word at about 9 pence, or the equivalent to half a British pound or 60 US cents in today's money per word. The message would be confirmed and then packed into a pneumatic tube which ran all the way up from the desk, hidden inside walls and paneling, into the ship's wireless office where it could be received and then transmitted out. The wireless office consisted of 3 main spaces: the small accommodation area for the ship's 2 wireless operators to rest, the Marconi room where the men would work to transmit the messages, and then the silent room. The silent room contained all the heavy machinery for transmitting and receiving, complex and powerful motor generators, condensers, disk dischargers, receivers and batteries. All of this was, for the time, absolutely cutting-edge technology. On the night of the sinking, Titanic's 2 wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, worked ceaselessly to coordinate a rescue, frantically reaching out to any and all nearby ships for assistance. As Titanic sank lower and lower into the water, though, the ship's ability to produce steam began to reduce and the motor generators for the wireless set began to slow. Therefore, the Titanic's range began to plummet. Other ships which had been in communication with the Titanic now heard her voice begin to fade, becoming quieter and harder to hear until finally, at 2:10 a.m. in the middle of a message, it shut out for good. James Cameron's dives to the Titanic wreck sought to explore this part of the ship and see just what kind of condition it was in, and he was in for a great surprise. Most of the Titanic's walls, or bulkheads, were simply made of timber, with steel bulkheads being reserved for sanitary reasons, mainly for separating bathrooms and toilets from hallways and other passenger spaces, but still plainly visible up on the boat deck are the pneumatic tubes which carried passenger messages up to the wireless office. But sadly, that office's walls are now gone, and the transmitting room has been devastated by the sinking. Interestingly though, the machinery in the silent room is still mostly standing and is in such good condition that it vividly tells the story of the Titanic's final moments. Unlike the rest of the Marconi office, the silent room was heavily padded with asbestos to limit the noise from the loud machinery and to prevent the spread of fire. On the night of the sinking, while Phillips was calling for help at the end, Bride must have gone into the silent room and fiddled with the machinery. Inside the silent room, beneath the main switchboard, was a pair of regulators which gave the operators the ability to control the power of their machine's spark, fundamentally the volume of the ship's transmitting voice. The handle for one of these is adjusted to the almost full resistance setting, increasing the speed of the generator motor to try to raise the Titanic's voice as loud as possible as the ship died. To balance this, the handle for the alternator was turned down low to try to compensate for the increased speed of the motor, and Bride must have been fiddling with these settings for some time to strike a good balance, but in the end, the pair had to abandon their office. The main switchboard's heavy handle is firmly down in the off position, telling us that Bride must have entered the room in the ship's final moments to turn the whole set off for good before the water got to it. Despite Bride's efforts though, it looks like a serious short circuit took place. With all that heavy-duty electrical equipment around, the wireless office is one of the last places you'd want to be in a sinking ship, and for good reason. Today, twisted wires, scorch marks, and once molten slag fragments and some of the remaining machinery tells us that as the set touched the water, there was a serious short circuit that started a raging fire. Today, the machinery of the silent room stands as a tribute to the hard work of the 2 wireless men. Harold Bride survived, but Jack Phillips was lost in the sinking. Luxury at sea was the name of the game for the Titanic, and it certainly did not disappoint. Probably one of, if not the, most fascinating features for passengers was the Turkish bath complex. This was a series of ornate rooms deep in the ship's hull on F deck, and at the time, their presence on board the ship was a huge deal. See, the concept of the Turkish bath had become hugely popular in England during the 19th century, thanks largely to the politician David Urquhart, who wanted to popularise Turkish culture in England for political reasons. Public bathing had been popular in Britain way back in ancient Roman times, but the practice had largely been forgotten about. But in 1857, the first public bath of its kind to be built on mainland Britain since the Roman age was opened. The interior was opulent and styled on the Middle East, and featured saunas, cooling rooms, and plunge pools in an arrangement similar to a modern-day spa or hot spring complex. It was an absolute hit, and in the following 150 years, 800 similar baths would be opened across Britain. Part of the success was the enchanting and mysterious Middle Eastern theme, which, to Britons, was enticing and fascinating. Interestingly, Olympic and Titanic were not the first White Star Line ships to carry a Turkish bath. The idea was first tested out aboard the company's liner RMS Adriatic in 1906. And this was the first passenger ship to feature both a bath and an indoor swimming pool. The feature was very popular and carried over to the company's newest and most luxurious ships. On Olympic and Titanic, they pulled out all the stops. The complex was simply breathtakingly decorated, particularly the cooling rooms at the entrance. This room featured ornate wooden paneling around colourful, hand-painted ceramic tiles with beautiful Middle Eastern accents. From the brass lanterns on the ceiling to the gold leaf domes that sat atop the doorways, the room was cosy and quite simply beautiful. But so were the other rooms, including saunas and steam rooms, shampooing and washrooms, and even an electric bath. In the main cooling room, there were lockers for your belongings and even a weighing machine with an attached chair to gauge if there was some difference made by the complex bathing process. The complex had its own dedicated attendants and was, predictably, very popular once passengers came aboard. On the night of the sinking, Steward Joseph Wheat was woken by the collision and went forward to investigate. There he saw the mailroom clerks dragging up bags of mail as water began to pour into the mail sorting room. Wheat sprang into action and, without orders, headed back to the Turkish bath and, with the help of two others, Steward George Dodd and Turkish bath attendant John Crosby, Wheat managed to manually close two heavy watertight doors which separated the swimming pool from the Turkish bath and the cabins just outside. Shortly after this, Wheat saw water begin to trickle down the stairs from above. This marked Titanic's doom because it meant that water was flowing freely over the top of the ship's watertight compartments. Now, the Turkish bath would begin to slowly flood, and Wheat made his way topside and found a place in a lifeboat, surviving the sinking. This slow but steady trickle of water gradually filled the entire Turkish bath complex, but it did so gently, and the result was incredible. Today, inside the wreck of the Titanic, the baths are one of, if not the, most well-preserved areas of the ship. Shining a light inside, expedition members were startled to see the hand-painted tiles still in place, their beautiful patterns crystal clear. The room is essentially a time capsule, and although the floor is littered in a layer of heavy silt, it's still easy to imagine passengers relaxing and lying back on the lounges inside. Unfortunately, because Wheat closed those watertight doors, Titanic's swimming pool has been forever locked away and must be in an even better state of preservation than the Turkish bath. We'll just never know though, because there's no way of getting inside. James Cameron's dive to the Titanic wreck found many unlikely and fascinating details, and one of these was particularly haunting. Throughout Titanic, across all three classes, virtually all toilets and bathrooms were communal. To do your business, you'd have to venture out into the hallway to a nearby set of water closets. But to account for freshening up, all staterooms featured some kind of wash basin. In first class, these could fold away and were part of a larger cabinet equipped with faucets that even had running water. There was also a mirror and some small shelves with rails to store drinking glasses and water jugs. On ships, almost all shelves need to have small railings to prevent items from falling off as the ship rolls. In 2001, James Cameron and his team were amazed to find many of these washstands still standing, but even more fascinated by one in particular, because there, still on the shelves, were a jug and a water glass. This is amazing for two reasons. For one, after the ship broke apart, Titanic's bow section plunged 13,000 feet or 4 kilometers down at a very deep angle and at what would once have been the ship's top speed on the surface. It impacted with the sea floor with force sufficient to break its back, blow out the sides, and crush decks down on each other. Water was even forced out at such high speed that the big number 1 cargo hatch, latched tightly onto the ship, was blasted off and away from the wreck. Yet incredibly, this water glass and jug sat safely on their shelves, protected from falling by the rails, undisturbed by the incredibly violent end that the ship suffered. There's another chilling reason why the Cameron expedition were captivated by this glass though. Archival photographs show the glasses were set by stewards upside down for the passengers' usage, but this glass is still sitting right side up, telling us that on the day or the night of the sinking, the cabin's occupants sipped from the glass and set it back down, and it still sits to this day exactly where that person last put it. Titanic's bow and stern section sit separated very far apart on the sea floor by about 600 meters or 2,000 feet. Strewn between these two great sections of the ship is a debris field containing just about everything you could imagine from a ship that had torn itself apart, from bed frames and shower heads to plates, cups and pots, glassware, twisted pipes and chunks of unidentifiable metal, tiles and spoons, all jumbled together in a heap that more resembles an airplane crash. But dotted throughout the wreckage though are wine and champagne bottles, and incredibly, the champagne bottles still have their corks in them. Titanic was expected to cater to its passengers, and drinking seems to almost have been as popular then as it is now. The ship carried about 1,500 bottles of wine, 15,000 champagne glasses, 20,000 bottles of beer and stout, and 850 bottles of spirits. On the cargo manifest were also listed about 63 cases of champagne, 17 cases of cognac, and 70 cases of wine, and 191 cases of spirits. It's a heck of a lot of bottles, and many of these were kept stored in the first-class saloon bar. Down on D-deck, the pantry was the room where stewards would assemble the meals readied by the galley, or the kitchen, on long counters. Adjacent to these counters was the saloon bar, with wine coolers and cabinets for sparkling wine. It was this section of the ship where Titanic broke apart, and the contents of the pantry were torn open as the ship broke up. Presumably, the first-class saloon bar totally disintegrated and showered the seafloor with bottles of wine and champagne. Dr. Robert Ballard and his team got the very first glimpse of the Titanic wreck and subsequently toured the debris field. They were amazed to find bottles of wine and champagne, and incredibly, the champagne still had their corks and their muselets, which are the wire cages on the top, still firmly in place. The wine, on the other hand, was ruined as the corks had been forced down into the necks of the bottles by the extreme water pressure. At that depth, 4,000 meters, the water pressure equates to a staggering 6,000 pounds per square inch, or 410 bar. That's 3 US tons per square inch. Anything hollow at that depth would have the air simply crushed out of it, and so it happened with the wine. But the champagne was different because the bottles were already pressurized to about, say, 70 pounds per square inch, but apparently this was enough to withstand the crushing forces at depth, and the champagne bottles remained intact. What would it be like drinking 110-year-old preserved wine? Well, in 2015, wine connoisseurs were excited to sample a unique drink. A bottle of wine had been found intact on the wreck of the Civil War blockade running ship, the Mary Celestia. After 150 years underwater, the wine had turned into a bizarre grey liquid, but experts were still keen to test it. The results were predictably not good, and the tasting notes were recorded as crab water, gasoline, salt water, vinegar with hints of citrus and alcohol. The mixture was still 37% alcohol, but 150 years at the bottom of the ocean had turned it into a sulfuric, seawatery and undrinkable mess. You can't help but wonder though what Titanic's in excess of 110-year-old champagne would taste like, having been sitting on the seafloor chilled all these years, but we may just have an answer. In 2010, a bottle of champagne was recovered from the ship intact, a 1907 vintage Heidsieck Goût Américain. It sold to a private collector and its taste notes haven't surfaced, but in 1998, the exact same vintage of champagne was also recovered from another shipwreck. The Swedish ship Jönköping was wrecked in 1916, carrying thousands of bottles of the stuff, and experts were keen to try it. They were amazed to find that the champagne still had fizz and was not merely drinkable, but actually enjoyable. The near century spent on the bottom of the ocean had kept the champagne chilled and aged its contents, creating a richer and more complex flavour. If you want to try one of Titanic's recovered champagne bottles, then you can. You just have to have $275,000 US ready to burn for the luxury. Titanic was designed and built by a guiding philosophy, to trick the first and second class traveller into forgetting they were even on a ship at all. The plan was to build a ship so vast for its time that passengers wouldn't really feel the sway of the ship, and to fill it with interiors inspired by the grandest hotels in Europe and America to make them feel right at home. All of it, the wood panelling, the delicate oak carving and detailing, the ornate staircases and gilt light fixtures, all of it was part of an elaborate illusion, not just luxury for luxury's sake. Many passengers were nervous travellers in the same way people today might not like flying. For centuries, going to sea in a ship was a dicey affair, and you were likely to end up wrecked. Titanic's designers wanted to put all that as far away from the passengers' minds as possible, and they found clever ways to do it. Probably my favourite example of executing this illusion could be found down on D-deck in the first-class dining saloon and the adjacent reception room. The reception room was a spot where passengers could congregate for light refreshments or tea on nice wicker furniture, surrounded by palms, before heading in for dinner in the main dining saloon. Now, looking at this space, you'd be forgiven for thinking this was actually the lobby of a hotel from the time. One crucial reason for this are the windows seen in the back here. But this space is located far down on Titanic's hull, where only portholes could be used to get natural light in. Windows would shatter under the weight of pounding Atlantic waves. Other ships of the time made use of portholes in the interior design of their dining saloons, but on Titanic this would shatter the illusion and make it clearly evident to the first-class passengers dining that they were on a ship and not sitting in a hotel. The solution was ingenious. In the region of the dining and reception rooms, portholes were doubled to let in as much light as possible, and on the reverse side, inside the first-class rooms, they were covered in huge, ornate, and finely detailed leaded glass windows. All the way along the two rooms, the leaded glass windows masked the portholes and natural light shone through them during the day, making it look as though they were the windows of a hotel. That wasn't all though. At night, these windows could be swung open and small lights turned on before they were closed back up again. These lino light lamps backlit the windows and made it look that natural light was flooding in even during dinner after sundown. Expedition dives down to Titanic's wreck reveal many of these windows still to be sitting in place. James Cameron even shone lights through the portholes outside to see the details in all their glory. Sadly, the ship broke up in the region of the dining saloon, so that room is almostly gone. The windows from that part of the ship, along with everything else in the middle, were ripped apart and scattered across a vast debris field. And incredibly, even after a 4-kilometre drop to the sea floor, dozens of those leaded glass windows survive largely intact. It's not just leaded glass windows scattered through Titanic's debris field. Down there you can also see hundreds, if not thousands, of floor tiles of all different colours and shapes. These also tell an interesting story of the era Titanic came from and speak of what was then a relatively new and exciting wonder material called linoleum. When you think of linoleum today, you might think of what once decorated your mum's kitchen floor. But in Titanic's day, it was a very different material. Derived originally from linseed oil or pine resin, linoleum could be manufactured in thick tiles and dyed in hundreds of different colours to make ornate patterns. The benefits for usage on ships are obvious. Linoleum is waterproof and stain-proof, ideal for dining rooms on a rocking and rolling ship where passengers might spill their food or wine on an otherwise pristine carpet. It's also decorative, hardy and lightweight. The colours were deep and vibrant and not prone to fading. It could easily be polished and brought back to life if scuffed. Many people are surprised to hear that the Titanic was not clad in marble flooring. This would have been impossible. The weight would make the ship dangerously top-heavy and liable to tipping over. Instead, in many of the grand public rooms, linoleum was used by the ship's builders, Harland and Wolff. Some examples of these include the big black and white linoleum tiles used in the grand staircase for first class. Red and blue tiles in a flower pattern were used in the first class smoking room. In second and third class spaces, fleur-de-lis motifs in red, green, black and white. But definitely, the most ornate were the tiles found in the first class dining saloon in a detailed pattern of blue, red and gold. Dotted around the wreck are these exact tiles torn from their original locations and scattered across the debris field in clumps and at random. Third and second class tiles can be seen piled together in groups, and other styles have even been recovered from the wreck, like this tile from the first class grand staircase. But most interesting are those from the dining saloon. For a long time, it was thought that this space was carpeted. When James Cameron made his 1997 movie Titanic, he had the set built with carpet from a company who said they were the original manufacturer of the original carpet used in that room. But when he later dived down to the wreck, instead he found huge blue, gold and red linoleum tiles intact on the room's floors and in the debris field. Some of these have since been recovered and put on display, and the colours are still plainly visible. In 1985, Dr. Robert Ballard and his team were scouring the Atlantic sea floor looking at the Titanic wreck and its debris field. These were some of the first sights anybody had seen of Titanic since 1912, and their eyes were glued to the monitor as the submersibles, 13,000 feet or 4 kilometres beneath their feet, broadcast back grainy footage. Twisted metal, drinking glasses and pots and pans, but then the head of a child's doll. In the 1860s through to the 1900s, lifelike dolls with porcelain faces became very popular among the children of the rich. The dolls cost about $40, or $1,200 in today's money, so they were mainly found among the upper crust and high society. The dolls often featured moving joints and were painted to look as realistic as possible, with vibrant glass eyes and real hair. This head had once belonged to a fine French or German doll and would have been beautifully painted. But by the time Ballard found it, undersea organisms had eaten away all of its cloth fittings and body, and the seawater had bleached it bone white. Its ghostly image was a real shock to the people on duty the day it was spotted. Such a shock that they didn't note its location, and the doll head has never been seen again. Another example of what we'll call the hotel at sea illusion were the incredible glass domes crowning the first-class grand staircases. Titanic had two grand staircases for first class, one forward and one back towards the stern or the back of the ship. This provided easy access for first class passengers to get around in areas where their cabins were located. In older ships, first class staircases looked similar to other staircases in use on the ship, although with more elaborate use of wood panelling. This is true of the generation of liner before Titanic, and in fact, on Titanic's original plans, the shipbuilders Harland and Wolff planned on installing this kind of basic staircase. But then the plans changed, and instead a large, sweeping and curved staircase was installed, creating a much nicer space for passengers on the landings and feeling much more like a lobby of a hotel or social club than a ship. For example, this is the staircase of the Australian Club in Melbourne, my hometown, which was built in the 19th century and bears a clear resemblance to that found on Titanic. But sitting above the staircases were large, oval-shaped domes. Made famous in the James Cameron movie, the domes featured a wrought iron frame with intricate, individual cut glass panels fitted within the patterns of the iron, and featured a chandelier in the centre to cast a large amount of light down the stairs at night time. Domes on ships like this weren't new. Skylights were an easy way to get a lot of natural light into the ships. But Titanic's staircase domes were particularly lovely and exceptionally large. On the night of the sinking, right at the end, Titanic's bow plunged down heavily and a massive amount of water began to press up on the dome's skylight cover from the outside. The inevitable implosion devastated the structure and everything underneath, and the dome was shattered into pieces. Meanwhile, the second dome at the staircase towards the stern of the ship was destroyed when the ship's back broke, and virtually everything between the ship's last two funnels was obliterated. But in 2010, expedition members made a fascinating discovery. Seemingly defying the odds, resting on the sea floor in the debris field was a huge section of that second dome, with the centerpiece still intact. The section comprises the center of the dome, along with the innermost decorative ring, and remnants of the chandelier remain in the form of copper sockets for the light globes, which have since turned green from seawater exposure. No sign of the forward grand staircase dome has been seen. It's not impossible that a part of it still remains in a decent state of preservation, but because the debris field is 2 square miles or 5 square kilometres large, finding it would be a bit like finding a needle in a haystack. Titanic's lifeboats were kept up on the boat deck, flanked by large cranes called davits. These were a special kind of davit designed by Swedish inventor Axel Wellen for the Royal Navy. Titanic's builders, Harland and Wolff, were keen to implement the very latest technology on Titanic, so the Wellen davit was chosen to service Titanic's boats. They had a special purpose. Hand-cranked, they could swing forwards and backwards. Backwards, so lines could be attached to a lifeboat kept on the deck, and then forwards to swing it out and over the side of the ship for lowering. This was useful if you wanted to keep a second row of lifeboats on deck to increase capacity. And in Titanic's case, Wellen actually recommended that the ship carry a second row of lifeboats, but in the end, only a single row was used, meaning the Wellen davit's special ability to be cranked far back in was never really used on the ship. Today, Wellen davits lie in tangled heaps on the sea floor. It's likely that during Titanic's sinking, the ship's great funnels were ripped from their bases or collapsed under intense water pressure, and their support cables, also known as stays, ripped up and down the boat deck, tearing davits from their positions and tangling them all up. But forward on the Titanic wreck, on the starboard side, is one lone davit still standing, and the position it's been left in tells us a fascinating story. See, right at the end, Titanic's first officer William Murdoch was frantically filling boats, and that davit lowered away emergency collapsible lifeboat C at 2 a.m. Once the lifeboat hit the water and its occupants detached their lines and rowed away, the davit arm was left cranked out far over the side of the ship. But then Murdoch and his team began to crank it back in to take another lifeboat. Collapsible A was roughly manhandled from its location on top of the officers' quarters and landed on the boat deck. In a rush, Murdoch and 6th Officer Moody began to attach the falls or ropes from the davit they'd just cranked in to the lifeboat. But suddenly Titanic's bow plunged downwards and water began to surge around the men's feet. The lifeboat couldn't be lowered away in the normal way because time had just run out. Instead, the falls were detached and the lifeboat floated off the ship and somehow survived clearing the funnel support stays and even the collapse of the ship's number 1 funnel. Murdoch and Moody were swept away, and both were lost in the disaster, never seen again. This davit they were working on is the only one still standing on Titanic's starboard side. Davits still in place on the other side of the ship, the port side, are still swung out in the positions they were left in after they launched their boats. But the starboard side davit is different. It's pointing straight up, still ready to take the lifeboat on that floated off and away from the ship. It stands as a monument to Murdoch and Moody's efforts that night, along with the heroic crew who struggled to get passengers off the ship and ultimately sacrificed their own lives. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.